Reason number 3 for back pain will be core instability. I'm going to split the core into two sections. The first section is going to target the internal core, the very deep muscles of the core that essentially provide compression of the lower lumbar spine. And then we're going to talk about the protectors of those muscles, which will be the external core. So the first muscle we're going to talk about is the most superficial layer of the protection wall. This is the external oblique. This muscle covers the entire midsection of the body. As you can see, it wraps around towards the ribs as well. So it's quite a massive muscle, and it's very important when it comes to function as well. So this muscle creates movements such as flexion to the side, rotation. But what's important when it comes to the core, it also creates compression and decompression coming from the top. So essentially it brings down the thoracic, the second layer of the outer wall that's essentially protecting the core, and this is the internal oblique. The internal oblique is essentially helping the external oblique protect the internal core. I know it gets a bit complicated here, but all these layers are necessary, and you're going to see why in a second. So the internal oblique creates movements such as rotation as well as external oblique, also creates the lateral flexion, but as well as the external oblique, it creates this compression in the abdominal area. What's really important though about the internal oblique that's different to the external oblique is that the internal oblique is an antagonist muscle to the diaphragm. So an antagonist muscle means that the internal oblique is creating a movement that's opposite to what the diaphragm creates when it contracts. And final layer of the protective wall, which is the rectus abdominis. The so-called six-pack, like most of you know it as, is a very important muscle, and it's essentially the last stand when it comes to protecting the internal core. So the rectus abdominis, the functions of this muscle is essentially stabilization of the pelvis and the rib cage, because it essentially connects the pelvis to the rib cage. That's quite important. Also creates the flexion, which is essentially the crunches that we kind of do in the gym. And then finally it creates this compression coming from the front of the body. So it essentially compresses the abdominal contents towards the lumbar spine. The first layer of the internal core, which will be the TVA, or the Transversus Abdominis muscle. So this muscle essentially wraps around the entire abdominal section and creates a corset around this section. So this corset is there in order to protect the abdominal contents, but it's also there to provide that stability to the lumbar spine when we're moving around. So just have a look at all this space now that I'm going to create when I kind of remove a lot of these layers. So I'm going to remove the external oblique, the internal oblique, and I'm going to remove the rectus abdominis. Once I've removed that, what you can see there is all of this open space that we have, which essentially is where the internal organs lie. See how much space we have there. So these muscles are there for a reason. They're there to protect and stabilize. The second muscle that we're going to talk about that's a part of the internal core is the diaphragm. The diaphragm is really important because once the diaphragm contracts, it will flatten and it will allow the ribcage to essentially elevate and then open up so that enough air can essentially come into the body. Once we've taken in as much air as possible, that's when we can essentially contract the core. This is where the specific exercises come into play, because the longer you can actually take a breath out, the more contraction you can create into your core. And this is where it gets a bit complicated when it comes to core stabilization. So we've talked about how the core is essentially stabilized from the top. So the diaphragm, the muscles such as the TVA, the protectors such as the external obliques, internal obliques, the rectus abdominis. Now it's time to look at the most intricate aspect of the core. The pelvic floor, which is a group of tiny muscles that are located at the bottom of your pelvis. So let's first of all start off with the Levator Ani group. So the role that it has in core contraction is the fact that it essentially allows that elevation and compression coming from the bottom of the pelvis. So if you imagine like the TVA contracting there, the diaphragm contracting on the top, all the muscles contracting around, and then the last part is the Levator Ani and the pelvic floor group essentially contracting from the bottom. So it's creating this kind of dome of compression.